Hello everybody, welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes and this is the channel in which we read some old books to some old people. No, I don't mean it like that. This is the channel in which we read wonderful old books to wonderful people of all ages. Welcome to the channel where I insult you before we even get going. It's, what is it, the 22nd of January 2021 as we do this at 4 o'clock in the UK. It's Children of the Archbishop, of which we are pretty close to the end, has to be said, but we may not finish it today or indeed on Monday, maybe Tuesday, that we actually get round to finishing it. Who knows? We're on chapter 52. Just a quick couple of hellos to everybody who is out there. Hello. There we go. Glad we got that out the way. Hello to TurboStream and the lovely Julia and Billabong O'Neill and Holly and Co. and Michael White and Justine Jones and Audrey Forbes and Witchfinder General and John F. Lovely to see you all. I have here, I'm sure there's other people, but they haven't said anything. So Justine Jones says, I'm younger than you. Are you? Good. That's handy. I don't want to be the youngest. I don't want to be the oldest in the class. I have my ginger and sweetie drink today. Ginger and sweetie, that's what it should be, or sweetie and ginger, whichever it works well. That's very tasty. Very tasty indeed. Lee Lawson says, I'm on the sofa with feet up, hot water bottle at my back. I shouldn't have been so enthusiastic in the garden yesterday. Oh dear, have you put your back out? Dave over yonder says, howdy. Howdy, partner. And Philip Hammond and Mary, good afternoon. Richard, Julia, and everyone, well done. Thank you so much for coming. Lovely to see you. Poor old Lee. I'm sorry to hear that, Lee. I hope you recover quick, Lee. But it's so easy to do. The thing is, you need to warm up. It's easy for me to say. I made a complete and utter fool of myself last year. Doing not exactly the same, but I went out for a walk and I went for a cycle ride, didn't I? And I didn't warm up my back beforehand and ding, oh, blimey. And there I was on the floor and I was giggling like a good un. Giggling at my stupidity, but I was in pain. Anyway, dear, oh dear, oh dear. Here we are again. Happy as can be, all good friends, jolly good company, as they say in Belgium. Not quite sure why they say it in Belgium, but there you are. So here we go, chapter 52. Dame Eleanor could feel all the loneliness of the years crowding in on her. As she lay there in the high double bed, she knew that she had no one. It was loneliness of a kind that she had never known before, like being the last survivor on a fading and depopulated planet. She lay back, simply staring into the emptiness of the ceiling. For a while, motionless, she listened to the insistent drub-drub, drub-drub of her heart. Then, silently, so that even the new companion should not hear, she began to cry. And once started, she turned her head sideways on the pillow and went on crying like a schoolgirl. After all, there was little enough to comfort her. Margaret was the only one person on whom she had thought that she could rely, and Margaret had shown once again that she cared nothing for her, nothing for a single thing on earth except her own idiotic emotions, and these were all being squandered on that child that she was so foolishly anxious to adopt, to mother. Surely Margaret could see how much Dame Eleanor needed her. Wasn't it obvious that the whole episode of Sweetie and Ginger had disgraced her publicly? Good afternoon to Dudley. Just seen that you've spotted it. He says, I have just overloaded the washing machine on a spin cycle. Ah, that'll make a noise and ruin the machine. I knew I would suffer today, but I didn't want to stop, says Lee in the garden. Rammy Boo, hello to you, Rammy Boo. I've answered your email, got that box yet unopened. I need to open it and sort it all out before I drop it round to the lovely Julia, but I will do it. I will do it. Have no fear. And Cooper68 snuck in at the back. Nice to see you. We have Dame Eleanor in bed feeling sorry for herself. That's all that's happened, ladies and gentlemen. So you have missed not very much. Anyway, so there we go. She would have... she felt... Wasn't it obvious that the whole episode of Ginger and Sweetie had disgraced her publicly? She would have to resign from the hospital, that much was certain. At her age, it was madness, sheer madness, driving her so hard. There could only be one end to it, the doctor had said, and each time, rather than describe what the end was, the doctor had simply spread his hands expressively wide, leaving so much emptiness between. Hello to Steve G, who's also sneaked in. The fool of a doctor wouldn't tell her how long she had got. He seemed to think that it was kinder, more professional, just to leave her there, wandering. But she didn't need any doctor to tell her. She knew. At the speed at which she was breaking up, she gave herself about another 3 months at the outside, possibly less, say 10 weeks. The one thing of which she was certain was that she would never know another spring. She had the picture of blossoming fruit trees in her mind, and felt convinced, for some reason, that she would never see them again. There comes a time, she reminded herself, when old people do really know that sort of thing. That was why she wanted everything to be as peaceful as possible during the remainder of the time that she had left to her. That's why she needed Margaret. Margaret was the only person who could look after her properly. She knew that from 20 years' experience. But as much as she wanted Margaret, she wasn't going to have her home turned into a reform school. And could anything be more absurd, she asked herself, than having a 14-year-old girl and a problem child at that suddenly introduced into the household, even when the doctors said that the very things that she needed was absolute peace and quiet? She paused. And while she's pausing, I'm just looking here. Ramibu says, you need to look at each bag closely. There is one in there for you. Oh, is there? One in there for me? Oh, I say, I shall open the box immediately. I thought it was all for Julia. Cheers, everybody. Oh, dear. Poor old Ramidu. Didn't sleep. Didn't sleep last night. Hope it wasn't the mother. Anyway, she paused. Of course, I suppose she could be put in the West Wing, she reflected, or over the kitchens. I would never see her then, or somewhere near the top of the house. Heaven knows there are spare rooms enough. She could have Derek's room, for all that matter. He's never going to use it again. She paused for a moment. Perhaps, she continued with her thoughts, if I did allow Sweetie to come here, Margaret could make something of her. It's worth trying. I wish I'd had grandchildren of my own. They take away the fear of death somehow, grandchildren. ... It was 9:30 next morning when the news of Dr. Trump's illness, his collapse, was phoned through to Dame Eleanor. Miss Prynne, the secretary, was first with the information. She was formal, diffident, polite. She didn't like bothering Dame Eleanor, she said, or appearing to be going behind Dr. Trump's back, but the warden was very far from well, and there was a lot of cheques that needed a second signature. Then Dr. Arlett came through, and what he had to say was most disturbing. It would be a month at least, he reckoned, before Dr. Trump was fit enough to resume, more possibly, if he didn't get away from the place at once. And, finally, Miss Warple came on the line. In some obscure way she regarded Dame Eleanor as belonging to the other camp, an enemy, and so she was short with her. So you see it's no good you asking him to carry on unless you can get someone, she told Dame Eleanor. And because I'm taking him away tonight, it'll be a miracle if I ever get him there. I'm ringing you up now to let you know what's happening. That was enough. It meant that Dame Eleanor would have to stop being an elderly invalid and become an administrator, a chairman, once more. By 9:45, even though her poor old heart was going thumpity-thump, thumpity-thump again, she had been on the phone herself and called for a board meeting, and what is more, she called it immediately, that very afternoon, in fact. It was not an easy meeting. Everyone's mind had been full of Mr. Sparks, and no one had given so much as a thought to Dr. Trump. In consequence, the board met in an atmosphere of bewilderment. It was like having the principal actor fall ill before the final curtain. It was indeed only Dame Eleanor who kept them at their business. "It's no use saying we didn't expect it," she told them. "It's happening, and it's no use pretending that this hospital will run itself without a warden, because it won't. We have to appoint a locum, and we've got to appoint him today." One by one, the names of the entire staff were considered, mauled over, and dismissed. After considering the staff, they next turned the searchlight on themselves. Dame Eleanor immediately made it clear to them that if it had not been for her other activities, the unmarried mothers and all the rest of it, she would have taken the vacant wardenship herself, would indeed have jumped at it, and so would the others, but for their own peculiar commitments. Canon Larkin, for instance, had just been called in by the Polynesian Mission Officers Association to advise on staff pensions, and was more than fully occupied. Mr. Chitt, the tract publisher, was taking practically full-time treatment for his rheumatism, had indeed emerged from a steaming seaweed compress, specially for that day's meeting, and had the tang of kelp and bladder wrack still clinging to him. Miss Bodkin couldn't even be made to understand why they were suddenly talking about themselves, and Mr. Chigwell had just got married. By then, the conversation had turned to the possible outside candidates, but nobody got anywhere. The board, indeed, was still hard at rejecting people when tea time came round, and Canon Larkin took out his watch and began shuffling with his papers. And then it was that Dame Eleanor showed herself at her most masterful, proved once again why she was chairman, and they were only governors. "Oh, no, you don't," she said, looking hard at Canon Larkin. "We're having tea served in here. We'll break up when we've found someone, and not before. We're all busy people, so we may as well go on talking while we're eating." Chapter 53. It was sheer kindness to Canon Mallow that he did not know what was happening up in Putney. As it was, he was sitting down to an after-dinner cup of tea in Miss Gurnet's private sitting-room, idly stirring round and round with the apostle spoon, long after the lump of sugar had melted, simply sitting, stirring, and thinking about nothing in particular. Mrs. Gurnet was there on the other side of the fireplace. It was one of her quiet times of the day, this moment when the doctors had gone, all the meals were finished, and the trays had been collected. When the night nurse took over, Mrs. Gurnet usually reckoned to have at least half an hour or so to herself, or rather half an hour or so with Canon Mallow. It had gradually become part of the pattern of the day that Canon Mallow should come down at this time. Not that there was anything crude or taken for granted about the arrangement. On the contrary, there was a delicate, preserved air of refinement and surprise. Every evening at 7:25, the night nurse knocked on Canon Mallow's door with the message that if he wasn't doing anything particular, Matron wondered if he would care to join her in her private sitting-room. And because Canon Mallow was never doing anything, he always thanked the night nurse kindly, and after a decent interval of 2 or 3 minutes, he followed her down the stairs. What was so nice was there was always the deeper of the 2 armchairs drawn up to the fire, especially for him, and by about 7:29 he would be comfortably seated in it. Tonight, in particular, the warmth of the little room enfolded him. It had the same quality as hot baths and fleecy bedroom slippers. He was a trifle on the tired side already, because he'd been at it pretty nearly all day, sending off more of those innumerable replies to old Bodkinians, who kept writing to him. And it was pleasant, very pleasant, to sit there with the heat of the fire on his knees and the standard lamp placed exactly in the right position on his left-hand side and about 6 inches to his rear. Miss Gurnet, too, seemed content to sit there, doing nothing, mostly, but brood over the small white-haired figure in the armchair opposite, watching for a moment when his cup was empty and he was ready for another one, just half a cup this time. And conversation, such as it was, never started until the cup had been put down for the second time and Mrs. Gurnet had rung for the maid to take away the tray. Tonight, the silence was longer than usual. Canon Mallow was drumming idly with his fingers on the arm of the chair, and Mrs. Gurnet was staring vacantly into the red honeycomb of the gas fire. Then, with her face flushed a little from the heat of the room and from her own proximity to the fire, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, and having uttered as much, she stopped herself. Canon Mallow looked up. There was a little half smile upon his face, a mixture of friendliness and surprise, as though even to be spoken to at all had taken him unawares. "Yes?" he asked. "It's about that room of yours," Mrs. Gurnet went on. The smile left Canon Mallow's face. You mean you want it?" he asked. Mrs. Gurnet's flush deepened. "Bless the man," she answered, and flushed even more deeply, realizing that she had never spoken to him in that way before. "No, I don't mean anything of the kind." Then what do you mean?" Canon Mallow's face was puckered into a frown now as he faced her. He wished that he could see Mrs. Gurnet more plainly, but with his reading glasses on it was impossible. All he could discern in the armchair opposite was a large square figure with what appeared to be an unusually bright pink face. But already Mrs. Gurnet was speaking again. "It's not healthy being cooped up in that room all day." "Oh, but I'm very comfortable there, I assure you," Canon Mallow replied. "I really am." "If only things were different, you could have had this for your study," Miss Gurnet explained. "I need only be in here in the evenings." The frown on Canon Mallow's face deepened. But how could they be different?" he asked at last. "I'm perfectly well content with everything just as it is. On the other hand, if you've got anything in mind, you've only got to mention it. I'm sure that I'll be able to fit in with whatever you suggest." "You're not making it any easier for me," Mrs. Gurnet told him. "But what would you like me to say?" Canon Mallow demanded. "I've told you I'm ready to agree to anything if it suits your convenience." "Well," said Mrs. Gurnet, bracing herself, "it's for you to decide, not me. But when two people have known each other but when two people who've known each other as long as we have don't seem to be able to get along without one another, and when there's no ties on either side, and when one of them isn't getting any when neither of them is getting any younger, and when there's a house and staff already and waiting, ... But she never reached the end of the sentence, for at that moment there was a knock at the door, and the maid came in with a telegram. It lay there, orange-coloured and menacing-looking, on the small electro-plated tray which Mrs. Gurnet insisted should be used for delivering all messages. "For the Canon, ma'am," she said. For a moment Canon Mallow said nothing. He was still too much confused and embarrassed to speak. It was only towards the end of Mrs. Gurnet's speech that he had realised the direction in which all this was leading, and he had no idea what reply to make. So instead of attempting a reply, he picked up the telegram from the tray that the girl was holding out to him. "If you forgive me," he said, "perhaps I better just see what it says." Mrs. Gurnet noticed that when he had seen it, he was so white that for a moment she thought he was going to faint. But in the circumstances, perhaps even that would have been excusable, for the telegram was certainly a sensational one. It was from Dame Eleanor, and it said everything in that silly, dreaming moments. And it said everything that in silly, dreaming moments, when he was just dropping off to sleep, he had imagined a telegram would be saying to him. "If health permits, can you return immediately? Bodkin Hospital. Take up temporary wardenship during sudden illness. Dr. Trump," it rang. "Board anonymously hopes you accept. Stop. Important reply by return. Stop." When he had read to the end of it, he remained silent. Then, still without a word, he passed the telegram over to her. Their eyes met. "If there's a train, I really ought to go tonight," he said. "Perhaps we could discuss the other matter later. I do so appreciate what you were saying." We come to the end of that chapter. He ducked out of that very quickly from Mrs. Gurnet. Ooh. Anyway. Everybody all right out there in the Vobosphere?
Yes, we're all right, thank you.
Oh, who said that? Chapter 54. I thought I was on 54. Are we on 55? Here, 54, chapter 54. As things turned out, Dr. Tramp is a new character that doesn't exist. As things turned out, Dr. Trump never returned to the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital. For a start, everything that Dr. Arlett had said about his condition proved to be correct. The natural strains of wardenship, coupled with the numerous reorganisations and dismissals and resignations, had already taken their toll. He was an exhausted man, even before the additional anxieties that Sweetie and Ginger had imposed on him. And just when he was really needing... when what he was really needing was a 6-week vacation to set him on his feet again, the dignified steamroller of Mr. Vivian Sparks had passed clean over him. It was the beginning of November when fate chose to strike Dr. Trump down. And in the end, he spent the whole of November and most of December at Broadstairs with Felicity and Sebastian, even celebrating Christmas in the small private sitting room of the Ragusa boarding establishment. But there was more than ill health behind it, for cut off as Dr. Trump was down there at the seaside, the ordeal of waiting for Mr. Sparks' report became daily more tormenting. Dr. Trump went to bed at night and woke again in the morning, usually with any number of false dawns in between, with the single thought, "What's he going to say about me? Shall I ever be able to hold my head up high?" always racing through his mind. And then suddenly the miracle occurred. Mr. Sparks' report appeared, and it vindicated Dr. Trump completely. Indeed, the findings of the report only went to show how appearances, even Mr. Sparks' distinguished appearance, may be misleading. For Mr. Sparks made it plain that he had been more than favourably impressed by Dr. Trump's personality. He found him... There were the words in black and white. He found him... There the words were in black and white typewriting of the Home Office, highly principled, conscientious, efficient. Admittedly, the word old-fashioned occurred a little later on the report, and there were some references to need, apparently overlooked, need for a specialist in child psychology to be attached to the hospital, but Dr. Trump was now in no mood for bothering about thrills and afterthoughts. The bit about a specialist in child psychology was absurd anyway, because he did not believe in child psychologists, and high-principled, conscientious and efficient were quite good enough for him. They were indeed what led him ultimately to offer Dame Eleanor his resignation. There was no pique and false pride about the gesture, nothing hurried, reckless, quixotic, if that's how it's pronounced. It was merely common shrewdness and a sense of optimism that prompted him. He had known for some time that the China and East Indies Missionary Society had been looking for a new organiser on the spot, a head man, someone who would be practically a bishop. And he had heard, too, before the deplorable affair of Sweetie and Ginger had blown up, that his own name had been considered more than once in its connection. That had been nearly 6 months ago, however, and at the time it had been the flattery rather than the prospect that had pleased him. It was the episode of the inquiry that had brought it all up again. Several times since he had first been threatened by an investigation, he had made cautious, exploratory feelers to see if the job, the important missionary headship, was still vacant, and it was. That heartened him. He even got as far as practising a few good openings. "In the eyes of Whitehall, I may not be all that a civil servant should be," he could say, lingering a little contemptuously on the words Whitehall and civil servant as he came to them. Or he might try something humble and disarming, like, "I have no references to offer. All I have to offer is my life." Or even the simple, manly one, "I'm afraid that I'm no good at talking about myself. He had become thoroughly proficient at the pause, the hesitation by this point. I've never had to do so before." By now, armed with Mr. Sparks' testimonial, what bliss it was not to have to get up to any of those tricks, the letter he finally sent off was a corker, a real challenge to the whole missionary movement. "Naturally," it concluded, I would not have considered even making it. Naturally, it concluded, I would not have considered even making known to you my deep, indeed, long-life interest in your work, so long as there was any possibility of a smirch upon my own good name. Publicly vindicated, however, by one of our most eminent KCs, ... End of that chapter. So that's seen old Dr. Trump out of it. Dame Eleanor, chapter 55. Dame Eleanor had made up her mind. She couldn't exist without Margaret, and she was prepared to admit it. The last companion, after a singularly unfortunate little incident when she had upset the whole carafe of water over Dame Eleanor's morning correspondence, had been sent packing, and Dame Eleanor now had no one. She therefore needed Margaret at once. But where to find her? And the thought that, through her own stubbornness, she had allowed Margaret to slip through her fingers, Dame Eleanor became desperate. She tried the police. She wrote to Arkindale. She pestered Canon Mallow. She inserted advertisements. She failed. And then, when the hunt was at its height, Margaret solved everything for her. She telephoned to ask if Dame Eleanor was better. The response surprised her. Dame Eleanor asked to come. The response surprised. Sometimes it's a tongue twister, this. The response. Better. The response surprised her. Dame Eleanor asked her to come round at once. It was the urgency of it all that bewildered Margaret. She began to fear that something had happened to Sweetie, that there was some alarming piece of news that they had to break to her. She did not guess that she herself was it was she herself that Dame Eleanor wanted, and Margaret had a job to think of too. She was now a kitchen hand in a restaurant and was getting £2 a week. She was even planning to save on it. Not that Dame Eleanor had been idle about Sweetie. On the contrary, so far as Sweetie is concerned, everything was practically arranged. For a start, she had sent for her brother, the bishop, and asked him to help her. He had come, a gaunt, vulture-like creature with long spatula fingers and pale, protruding eyes, and had sat beside the bed, fiddling with his ring and listening suspiciously to what his sister was saying to him. He always hated getting mixed up with family affairs. It was somehow only in other families' affairs that he was so wise, so prescient, so episcopal. And what he disliked particularly was the way Eleanor always swept him along. She was always a rusher. Unless he was careful, he had to keep telling himself, he would find himself let in for something foolish. He had not yet forgotten the snub, the poke in the eye from the Home Office when he tried to forestall Mr. Vivian Sparks's inquiry. So, after saying for the third time, "Let me make some inquiries first, dear. Let's see how we stand," he had given her a dry, refrigerated kiss and withdrawn. But this time everything had been quite simple. The family tentacles had reached out firmly, possessively. The chaplain of Blackheath Remand Home proved to be an old pupil of the bishop's. He had, in fact, ordained the man. There were no different difficulties there. The matter of the public accommodation was, moreover, on Sweetie's side as well. The Blackheath Remand Home was already crowded out with 101 other Sweeties, all in need of a good home background and firm supervision, and when it came to the chance of moving Sweetie on and so making room for still another one, the authorities jumped at it. She could leave the remand home next Monday, they said. Chapter 56. Michael White. Quixotic. How is that pronounced? Quixotic, is it? Tilting at windmills. Tilting at windmills? What does that mean? It was 5 o'clock on a November morning. Sorry, read again. It was 5 o'clock on a November afternoon when Margaret went across from Dame Eleanor's to collect Sweetie. And all the way in the big old-fashioned car, Margaret kept saying to herself, "It's going to come true. It's going to. Just like I knew it would. I shall have Sweetie for always now." What's this? Quixotic. Quixotic. Having or showing ideas that are different and unusual, but not practical or likely to succeed. Don Quixote. What? What? Quixotic, as in... I thought Don Quixote was Quixote. Quixotic. Right. Thanks for that, everybody. Anyway, she made a strange figure sat there amid the interior splendour of the tassels and ivory handles and the little cut glass bottles. She was sitting right forward on the edge of her seat, but that was only because she was so excited, too excited, in fact, to lean back, too excited to do anything but wait for the moment when she would see Sweetie again. The light was already fading from the sky when they drew up at the high green gates outside the home. They were a blank, forbidding pair of gates, with a metal grille set into the middle of one of the panels, and when they opened, Margaret could see into a stone-paved courtyard, flanked on 3 sides by a high brick wall. She shuddered. "It's not right," she told herself. "It's like a prison. They never ought to have sent Sweetie here." It wasn't, however, so much the bleakness of the place that Margaret minded. It was the fact that they had brought Sweetie to her. It was the fact that when they brought Sweetie to her, the matron had her arm around Sweetie's shoulders. She was suddenly jealous of the woman. It was only natural that other people would like Sweetie. She didn't see how they could help it, in fact. But it wasn't fair to go shutting her away like this and then start playing on her emotions. It was stealing something that, by rights, belonged to Margaret. And now that she had looked, she noticed there was a little change in Sweetie. In less than a month since she had last, it was less than a month since she had last seen her, but somehow she was different. They'd given her new clothes when she arrived home. Perhaps that was it. Or was it the way the hair was done? Margaret leant forward. They haven't been cutting Sweetie's hair, have they? She asked herself. But it was more than Sweetie's clothes or the way her hair was done that was different. And as Margaret looked at her, she realised what it was. She's growing up, she told herself. That's what she's doing. She's growing up. For some reason, the thought frightened her. I only hope I'm strong enough to deal with her, she went on. But I've got to be. I'm going to make her grow into a good girl. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make her good. Her eyes met Sweetie's for a moment, but only for a moment. It was as though Sweetie were avoiding them. There was that sudden pang again, a feeling as though something had been stolen from her. She started to reach out her hand, then she restrained herself. She doesn't love me any more, she began saying. Something's happened to her. She doesn't. The green gates had closed behind them, and they were alone at last. Margaret was too happy now to speak. She was afraid that if she said anything, Sweetie would know that she was crying from sheer happiness at having got Sweetie back again. All the same, the ride back was not how she imagined it. Unthinkable as it may seem, they quarrelled. It happened quite suddenly. At one moment there was Sweetie snuggled up against her, holding Margaret's hand in hers, and then, with the other, Sweetie had produced something from her coat pocket. "Look," she said, "one of the other girls gave it me. It's lipstick." She was obviously proud of it. It was a treasure, a symbol. That was why it was so unforgivable when Margaret snatched it from her, and having snatched it, she did worse. Pulling down the window of her car, she threw the lipstick out into the street that was gliding past them. "You're not to use lipstick," she said. "You're too young." Sweetie turned on her. "Why can't you stop bossing me?" she said. "I didn't ask you to come here. I'm going to use lipstick. As soon as I've got some money, the first thing I'm going to do is buy some lipstick." But Margaret was angry too by then. "Lipsticks are wrong," she said. "Do you hear me? They're wrong. You're never to use them. At rate, not until I say so. Not until you're old enough to understand." There was silence for a while. For so long, in fact, that Margaret was beginning to be afraid. She thrust out her hand towards Sweetie, but it was no use. Sweetie avoided her. She remained there, her body rigid, her head turned away, staring resentfully out of the window. Margaret could see the cold, sullen face reflected in the glass. "She's tired, that's what's the matter with her," she told herself. "And I ought to have been nicer. It's all my fault. I ought to have waited until tomorrow." And she began to tell Sweetie about the new life that she was going to lead, about the bedroom that she'd already got ready for her. Dame Eleanor had already decided on the little side room up on the west wing because the staircase led right up past Margaret's door. "And it's going to be lovely," she said. "You won't never, she corrected herself, "you won't ever have to wear a uniform anymore. And we'll find you some friends of your own so you won't be lonely. And we'll go on walks together in the evenings. If Dame Eleanor settled, in the evenings, if Dame Eleanor's settled, then we can just sit there. My bedroom is like a sitting room. It really is. And you can come in there." Sweetie's hand was in hers by now. It was warm and soft and confiding. I'm sorry I was cross just now," she said. Margaret squeezed her hand. The car reached Putney Common by now. Sweetie had been there nature walking. It was pleasant, this, like coming home again. Then a shadow passed across her face. "Where's Ginger?" she said. "Oh," Where's Ginger? Ginger's still on her mind. We still have quite a bit to go. As a matter of fact, Ginger was miles away, right off the map somewhere at a farm school in Norfolk. And this was because the law, having summoned him up, took a pretty serious view of Ginger. He had the twin charges of breaking open and larceny against him, and as a potential criminal and a menace to society, he was regarded as altogether too unstable for ordinary probation. It was really Canon Mallow whom he had to thank for being sent to a farm school, only he didn't know it, and Canon Mallow didn't know it either. Indeed, when the detective sergeant came to see Canon Mallow and asked such a lot of questions about Ginger, he felt that he could hardly have given the boy a better all-round character. But what the detective sergeant seemed to be chiefly interested in was a little matter of £50 that he was supposed to have been given to Ginger. And here, if only the detective sergeant had explained things properly, or if he had taken the trouble to make Canon Mallow realise that everything depended on whether Ginger had really believed that £50 was his or not, Canon Mallow's answer might have been different. As it was, the detective sergeant asked the plain question, had Canon Mallow ever given Ginger £50? And he received the plain answer, no. But can you wonder? Past 70, the mind plays all kinds of tricks. Whole episodes are erased sometimes, and, with not so much as a single clue to help him, Canon Mallow could not remember a thing, simply not a thing. Towards the end of the interview, he did admittedly get the impression that perhaps he ought to have remembered, that perhaps he was disappointing the detective sergeant, and he tried to make amends for it. I may have given the boy £50, he said. One can't be sure, can one? It's so long ago, but it's a matter of a large sum, £50, isn't it? If it had been sixpence or a shilling, I could have understood it. Of course, if he says so, I suppose I must have done. But I wonder why. I don't usually go about giving £50 away, at least not that I'm aware of. But I can't be certain that I didn't, you know. It's only that I would probably have remembered it. In the face of evidence such as that, and Canon Mallow repeated it all in court in much the same terms until the children's magistrate had thanked him politely and invited him to stand down, it was decided that Ginger really had stolen the money, that he was a thief, and, more than a thief, a burglar into the bargain. It was that bit about forcing the padlock with the poker that counted most against him, and with such a record, nothing less than a couple of years of institution life could be regarded as really tackling the problem. Now that was how it was that Ginger came to be travelling up to Norfolk by train in company with an elderly probation officer, rather like a dubious and despondent sheep, who kept one eye trained suspiciously on dangerous spots, such as exits and lock-up lavatories. Ginger wasn't actually handcuffed, but that was the feeling, and he felt pretty rotten about things, just sitting there in the compartment with the jumpy old sheep edged up so close on the seat beside him. The future at that moment just didn't seem worth living for. Even to have gone into a butcher's shop would have been better than having to go back to school again. And of all the balmy kinds of school, a farm school seemed to Ginger just about the balmiest of them all. But 24 hours later, he wouldn't have been anywhere else on earth. It wasn't the situation, bang in the centre of some of the flattest, dullest-looking country in the whole of England. It wasn't the house, the large, flat-faced sort of mansion like... Yes, well, like what it was, like a school. It wasn't the principal, a youngish, curly-haired enthusiast who embarrassed Ginger by linking arms with him straight away just to make him feel at home. It wasn't the food, or the games, or the companionship, or the animals. It was the tractors. There were two of them, both Fordsons, One was practically new, with the gloss still on the paintwork, a veritable Beau Brummel among tractors. But it was the other one, ancient, discoloured, honourably scarred, that tugged at Ginger's heart. And this was because its clutch had been taken down. Drawn up in the centre of the repair workshop, the tractor stood there, degutted, its entrails spread neatly around the floor, and an instructor mechanic was lecturing on the various parts, holding them out at arm's length as he did so, like a coroner carrying out a rather interesting post-mortem in public. Ginger was right at the back for the first session. After the lunch break, however, he managed to work himself to the front row, and by tea time he had been appointed assistant demonstrator and was allowed to pass the bits and pieces. He went to bed that night in a happy consciousness of a good day entirely well spent. There had been virtue in it, and he fell asleep with his mind full of dry plates and grease washers and countersprings and Faraday facings. His past life, dull, trivial, unrewardful, it now seemed in retrospect, slid from him. He forgot about the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital and the reservoir in which he was nearly drowned himself, and the Archidale institution and the children's court and all the rest of it. First-hand acquaintance with a reciprocating rocker arm had temporarily banished all other memories. Even the memory of Sweetie herself had slipped quietly away in the midst of them. He's forgotten Sweetie. Oh, my. Poor old Ginger. What's happened to him? He's growing up. And now we're on book 6, ladies and gentlemen. The Portrait and the Frame, chapter 7. Chapter 57. It's Nigel Sadler just arrived. Nice to see you, Mr. Sadler. Poor old Sweetie. How are we doing? We've got 45 minutes. Oh, hang on a minute. I need to put a piece of wood on the Essie. I'm sorry to disturb everything, but there's a moment you can talk amongst yourselves. I must just stick a lump of wood on the Essie. Otherwise it'll be out. Probably out already. Can't do that. You can't desert the broadcast. It's outrageous. Unprofessional. It's all right. I wouldn't have had a dinner otherwise tonight. Forgot about it. I meant to put a big lump of wood before we started. Then suddenly it went, oh. Right, book 6. We've only got 15 minutes, so let's see how we get on with it. Well, there you are. With Canon Mallow back at the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital, where we first met him, and Ginger getting along nicely at the farm school, and Sweetie and Margaret together again, and Dame Eleanor herself made thoroughly comfortable once more, the outlines of the pattern are beginning to appear. There is certain discernible shape, even shapeliness. All lives, and indeed all collections of lives, are like that. If you withdraw far enough to get an angel's eye view of things, as it were, and see the span of time as a whole, there is always the perfect and final pattern waiting somewhere. It may be something quite tiny, covering a few years or months or weeks even, a mere design in miniature set inside the big, untidy scribble of existence. The trouble is that so many people rush at it, kidding themselves that they have studied the whole plan when they've really only observed one small part of it. Then, at best, what emerges is a botch-up, lopsided affair, a sort of badly made picture frame that 10 to 1 contains the wrong portrait altogether. Indeed, that is just the way it would be if the Archbishop Bodkin Chronicles were chopped off somewhere about this point. The shape would all be there all right, but as it happens, it would be the wrong shape. To see the whole thing properly, to get the placid, uncrowded view to which the angels are accustomed, there is nothing for it but to withdraw further still. Take about another 4 years of it, in fact, and even then it's only somewhere towards the end where something happens to Sweetie and something else to Dame Eleanor that the true picture jumps at us. It may be that the whole pattern is really a jigsaw. The little chunky bits have gradually been assembled by themselves through the years, ever since 1920, in fact, when Sergeant Chiswick carried Sweetie off the doorstep. But he didn't know then that it wouldn't be until nearly 18 years later, with beer gone up ninepence and another world war just around the corner, that the final little twiddly bit, the key piece itself, would be slotted into place and the portrait in the frame would be complete. Didn't, for that matter, know even whose portrait it was going to be, whether it was Sweetie's or Ginger's or Canon Mallow's or Dr. Trump's or Margaret's or Dame Eleanor's. But it would not have worried him, for Sergeant Chiswick was never of the thinking kind, and in any case, by the time 1938 came along, Sergeant Chiswick had backed his last loser and dropped quietly out of the pattern altogether. Oh dear, I think that means he died. The interlude only heightens the tension, says Michael White. I'll nip out and put another lamp on then. Yes. Ah, dear. Right, here we go. Meanwhile, the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital was in a state of confusion. Dame Eleanor had been ordered by her doctor to rest, and with Margaret there to look after her, she was prepared this time to obey orders. In consequence, it was Canon Larkin who pro tem presided at meetings. A born administrator with a keen actual sense, he naturally spent a great deal of his time in discussing the nature of the hospital's financial settlement with regard to Dr. Trump. How long should full pay continue, he asked? What limit should be placed upon the half-pay period? Did sick leave count for purposes of pension? Was the warden's lodging a prerequisite or an emolument? Emolument. He was a great man for thoroughness and detail, and he succeeded finally in bewildering even himself. In the result, Dr. Trump continued to receive his full cheque every month, and Canon Mallow, who was unable to get a word in edgeways, even when it was about hospital business, was left to direct the Bodkin fortunes single-handed. And in small ways, he managed to make his presence felt. Within the first month, he got all the keep-off-the-grass notices removed, and by Christmas he had engaged a platoon of robust old women to do the rough cleaning and to save the girls, some of whom who were quite small, Canon Mallow had noticed, from having to carry out such heavy buckets. Then, as an extra Christmas present, he decided the probation about masters smoking in their bedrooms. He relaxed the probation about masters smoking in their private bedrooms. I'm sure Dr. Trump wouldn't mind, he kept telling himself. It's all so reasonable. But here it would have been difficult for Canon Mallow to do otherwise, because he was, by way of being a rather absent-minded kind of smoker himself. Quite often he found himself with his own pipe in his mouth, and the old briar drawing nicely without so much as the slightest recollection of having packed it at all. But Dr. Trump had been a firm disciplinarian, and discipline dies slowly. Try as he could, Canon Mallow was not able to get the children to let themselves go properly. They walked when he felt they should run, and they talked in whispers when he would like to have heard them shouting to one another. Altogether, it was as though they had just slipped out of class to attend a funeral. Admittedly, things were a bit better already on the boys' side, since he had given permission for football to be used, and one of the ground floor windows had already gone, lead lights and everything. But Canon Mallow was quite frank about the position. "It's going to take years, literally years," he said, "to knock that discipline out of them. I don't know yet whether I shall have time to succeed or not, but it's got to be worth trying." I'm just looking at where we are. I think it might be wise to stop. It might be wise to stop here because we have the weekend, don't we? We have the weekend. We've got. Yes, I'm not going to get to the end of this chapter very easily, so I think we'll stop there because it's come to a natural break. So there we are. That's Friday, done and dusted. Thank you very much. Turn that fire off quickly. Another reading. We've probably got Monday, and we may get to Tuesday, and then the rest of the week. I think we're going to start this one, hopefully. The Thames to the Solent by Mr. Dashwood. Is it? Yes, J.B. Dashwood, which is a nice, simple little book. Probably not as funny, but engaging. Hopefully. Engaging, and then we can have a think about what we're going to do next. I've got another Edward, what's his name? Tickner Edwards, which I'm quite keen to do. We've got another Walter Wilkinson up there. There's a few more of these in Sussex type of books. Double-Edged Blade. I want more of the story now, but I want it to last longer, says Julie. Well, there are some other Norman Collins. I'll have to have a look at some of the other Norman Collins books because we could do... London Belongs to Me is a great one, but it's quite long. It's about double the length of that, I think. But it's very good. And they made a film of it. But if you see the film, it does ruin it. Because the film is very good, actually, and very truthful to the story. Although, of course, the story has more of the sort of elements of mundaneness that I love. Has a lot of bus journeys in it, as I recall. I think there's a couple of other books. I mean, he some of the other books aren't as they're good, but they're not as good. Not funny like this. I think we can all cope with a serious book again. Lee Lawson. Not funny like this. I hope we can all cope with a serious book. Yes. Long story is good, says the lovely Julia. Well done, Richard. Thank you very much. Double Edge. Yes, there we go. Save some for next week. No problem. Dudley says, sorry, I missed a chunk. There was a phone call. Take the phone off the hook. That's the thing. I've now put my phone on silent. I better put it back on, see if there was anything on there worth listening to. Yes, great read. Good stuff. I will catch up with you next week. It's the weekend coming up. We have a walk tomorrow. Should be online. I'm going to go and cook a spaghetti bolognese now for my dinner. And then the lovely Julia and I will be live, but separate, if you see what I mean, like we normally have to do now, on the show this evening. More fun and games. We needed a laugh after 2020. Absolutely. We blooming did. Well, if anyone's got any if you've got any thoughts on not comics, but comedic books that we can read that are out of print, or, that are old enough that no one's going to worry about. I mean, I'm sure some of these books that I've read, there would be copyright things on them. But to be honest, it's such a small audience, and we're not doing it in a, the professional way where it's all word perfect and whatever. It's got interruptions and things. Then do let me know any ideas that you have. But anyway, we've got one at least to get us through the next one, and then there's some other ones that we can get going on and what have you. So there you are. Anyway, take care. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for the company. It's lovely. It gives me, if anything else, I tell you, it gives me an excuse to read, which I love to do, and I love reading out loud, and I enjoy the performance of it all, so it's all good fun. Anyway, that's it. Take care. Thanks very much. Curtain goes down, and I say au revoir, like this.